On this day, in 1945, a circumstance that extended back past the advent of the war as far as the Depression years in the early 1930s and, by our current day standards, would seem somewhat of a ridiculous situation, came to an ultimate and very ugly head. On the outbreak of World War II, the federal government had passed the National Security Act, a piece of at times divisive legislation that, amongst a multitude of wide-ranging regulations, laid down strict rules for maintaining supplies and services essential to the life of the community. Under Regulation 4 of the Act, ration levels for foodstuffs were set and fixed pricing for staples were implemented, set down by the Commonwealth Price Fixing Commissioner in charge of the Prices Branch. However, in the case of bread manufacture, the master bakers of Brisbane found themselves in somewhat of a bind. Having not long recovered, albeit to only a minor degree, from the recent depression of the 1930s that had swept across not only Australia but the world, bakers around Brisbane were already operating on the slimmest of margins, compounded with fixed Commonwealth pricing implemented in 1938. With further fixed pricing dictated via the National Security Act in 1939, coupled with the price of raw materials necessary for the production of bread, the master baker's plight increased exponentially. In early 1940, a marginal reduction in the price of flour aided in the baker's daily trade, slightly increasing the scant margins under which they'd been trading. However, as the war years progressed, their operation came under a renewed threat. Unions, unhappy with the stagnation of wages within the baking industry, pushed back against the government, with requests for increases to the award, which were continuously knocked back. Similarly, the pricing branch refused to budge on an increase in sale price to cover the shortfall of an increase in wages. By 1944, stuck in the crossfire, the baking fraternity of Brisbane and Queensland had been pushed to virtual breaking point. Unable to retain staff due to pitiful pay conditions, coupled with an oft-times inability to even cover their own operating costs, some bakers across Brisbane began to take matters into their own hands, illegally raising the fixed sale price of their wares in defiance of the wartime regulations. In January 1944, Walter Ernest Pavey was charged and fined £125, with £6 15 shillings costs in the Wynnum Court of Petty Sessions for selling loaves of bread exceeding the fixed sale price. Again, on the 16th of March, Master Baker Charles Manderton of Lotta was brought before the Court of Petty Sessions and fined £120 with £8 2 shilling cost for breaching the price restrictions. Realising something had to give, the master bakers across the region began lobbying the authorities for a relaxation in pricing, buoyed in the hope the government would see reason and provide a solution, which, by April 1945, had still not been forthcoming. So, through early April 1945, meetings were held across the region to discuss the possibility of strike action in violation of the National Security Act. Tensions continued to flare on the tabling of a cost accountant's report drafted on behalf of the Associated Bread Manufacturers, strongly supporting a price increase from 5.5 pennies to 6 pennies per loaf. With the government's continued refusal to enter into negotiations, a baker's ballot was conducted, and on the morning of the 16th of April, 72 of the 78 bakers across the city refused to light their ovens. The breakfast tables of Brisbane were thrown into turmoil, with reports stating queues outside city and valley stores where bread was available were controlled by policemen. Women stood for hours hoping to get enough bread for their households. A few were disappointed. After hours of waiting, bread supplies ran out and queues had to be turned away. On Prime Minister John Curtin wading into the fiasco and demanding the bakers return to work, his pleas fell on deaf ears. So, on the morning of the 18th of April, after 2 further days of strike action in flagrant breach of the wartime regulations, Commonwealth authorities launched legal proceedings against the belligerent bakers, issuing over 60 summonses to appear before the police court. With a number of £25 fines handed down by the police magistrate and further sporadic strike action launched across Queensland in the subsequent days, the Federal Pricing Commissioner, Professor Copland, would finally agree to meet in Canberra with a contingent of the associated bread manufacturers, thus slowly and painfully brokering a shaky truce with the master bakers of Brisbane.